Welcome and thank you for joining me for our exploration of New York, the greatest old world buildings. New York City, one of the older cities in the United States on the East Coast, situated on one of the largest natural harbors in the world and currently one of the largest metropolitan areas in the world, the most densely populated city in the United States, and the largest city in the United States. This is often an area that is difficult for alternative researchers because, according to the narrative, this city has had a European presence on it since 1624, and it's been continuously occupied since then. Here's a photo from the 1860s, and this is what we'd expect to see. A very well built out city that makes a lot of sense with what we would term as either Victorian or Elizabethan architecture. You see another photo from the early 1870s, and again, this being the largest natural harbor in the world, or one of the largest, and the city that's developed on it. At this time, it's already been around for nearly 200 years. So this makes sense. There is not a series of conflicting accounts with the narrative that we can easily find inconsistencies with. We could actually believe that New York City is built out as it's depicted here. And even though this may not be an actual picture and it's just a drawing or a produced picture by an artist, it does give us an idea of what the city looked like with the City Hall, St. Paul's Church. We'd expect to see these kind of buildings, and we understand why the city, being populated for a long time, being the central entry point for the United States at that time, it does make sense as to why this could be so built out. And we see Federal Hall, which is where the United States Revolution began, or at least the revolution of the colonies to become the nation of the United States. New York has so many interesting aspects to it, though. There's so many intersections with it. Taking a look over here at the Battery on Manhattan Island. And our exploration is going to focus on Manhattan Island, specifically looking at the skyline. And we're looking at the most significant buildings. Many of the buildings that we're going to be looking at on the Manhattan skyline were either, at one point in time, the tallest building in the world, or one of the most prolific buildings in the world. We look back here in this drawn picture and we see many cathedrals and many other large buildings, again in the early 1870s. And we can explain this, even with the narrative that we're given, as we're told it took decades or longer to construct many cathedrals. There's, of course, exceptions to that rule, such as the four-year cathedral we saw built in Cincinnati. Here's another depiction of New York City in the early 1870s. Oddly enough, we see what looks to be a completed Brooklyn Bridge, although it was under construction, or we're told it was under construction in 1873, which was exactly when this this picture was produced. Again, we see some odd details in this particular rendering or this painted picture. It almost looks as though several of the blocks are lacking detail, as though we see something that almost looks like the Kowloon walled city over in Hong Kong, here in New York City. We still see the familiar details that we saw in the earlier picture. And finally, we see a later picture from the early 20th century, where we see many of the skyscrapers that are built out. Now keep in mind we've just looked at painted pictures. Anybody could have drawn these, they could have put anything on them that they wanted. What about some photographs or some images that show us some hard proof? Or at least what we could derive from images. And here we see a comparison of the Manhattan skyline from 1872, 1902, and 1908. And many of the buildings that we'll be looking at, we do see two on the skyline. We see in 1872 the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge, and we see that the skyline only has a few buildings on it and many cathedrals. But then in 1902, we see that many skyscrapers and tall buildings have suddenly been constructed. And this is where the narrative finally reaches its questioning point, because we know that the first skyscraper was the New York World Building, completed in 1890, and it appears in the 1902 picture. You can also see it in the 1908 picture. Finally, the Singer Building, which the tower was added and completed by 1908, and it just happens to appear in the 1908 picture. It's incredible the amount of tall buildings that were completed in a very short period of time. If we go off the 1902 picture and we factor in the fact that the New York World Building, pictured here in 1902, was built in 1890, and the rest of these taller buildings followed, that's a lot of construction to complete in 12 years. Is that truly possible? Is it practicable that the city of New York could have done that with all the labor they had available, with the fact that it is one of the largest natural harbors in the world, and it's a main intersection and entry point for the United States? Certainly they would have had the labor. But what about the feasibility and the amount of materials it would have taken to build all these buildings in that short amount of time? What do you think? Is this something that was feasible? Or was this something that shows that there's something else going on? Could this be some sort of evidence of alternate realities? Or does it really show that there's manipulation of the timeline? Someone's changing the 5 W's. The who, what, where, when, or why, so that we do not understand the how. All of these possibilities are on the table, and that's why considering New York City and the Manhattan skyline are very fascinating. The first building we're going to take a look at is the New York World Building. The New York World Building, also known as the Pulitzer Building, was a building in the Civic Center of Manhattan along Park Row, part of Lower Manhattan's former newspaper row. It was designed by George B. Post in the Renaissance Revival style. Yes, because what else would it be? Renaissance Revival style with an incredible dome on top of it and an amazing arched entryway. I wonder what other style name we could come up with it. Perhaps we'll just call it Dreamy Dome style. The World Building contained a facade made of sandstone, brick, terracotta, and masonry. Its interior structure included brick interior walls, concrete floors, and an internal superstructure made of iron. There were 12 full stories, 2 basements, and a 6-story dome at the top of the building. The pinnacle above the dome reached 350 feet. When the building was in use, the World primarily used the dome, which was the newspaper, ground floor, and basements, while the other stories were rented to tenants. The World Building's design generally received mixed reviews, with criticism focusing mostly on its immense scale. Now, why would that be, one wonders? Perhaps you're ready for the piece of resistance. How long do you think it took them to build this incredible beauty? 14 months. They started construction October 10, 1889, and completed it in December 10, 1890. I'll tell you what, those skilled artisans and all those immigrants that they had back then, they were unbelievably skilled laborers. They could do anything. We have to lament the fact that we don't really have interior pictures available, just drawings. And here we see the World Building as some other taller buildings have come up, and yet it still stands out by virtue of its incredible dome and the Roman Forum type structure that we see, only this one's built about 6 stories in the air. It almost appears like it's a Capitol building, yet when you look at the ground level, you see its arched entryway and all of the incredible stones that went into building it. Again, we see the scaling with the columns on it, and some incredible detail with the windows, not to mention the height of the windows. This is a very beautiful building, and it was quite a skyscraper for New York City to start with. And as we look up it, we see the detail of the dome and pediment, which is the triangular gable that I typically call the Roman Forum structure. We also see the portal windows in the dome and then the high spire on the top of it. Just a building that you don't see a lot of examples of. Really a Capitol type building that seems like it was built in the format of a skyscraper. And now we move on to the Singer Building, a building that was constructed in phases from 1897 to 1908, with the tower being the final portion that was completed in 1908, and once the tower was completed, it was the tallest building in the world. This, of course, was a Beaux Arts and French Second Empire style. Now, we'll think of some names as we go through looking at this beauty. We have a construction photo of the Singer Building, although we have the same issues that we do with many other construction photos, and it's one of the recurring challenges with trying to verify the narrative. It's also a challenge with questioning it as well, because what do we make of these kind of photos? There's some detail that appears to be authentic, but then you have clashing detail. The interior of the Singer building is just otherworldly. You see these beautiful arches, these windows, and the detail in each of the columns and the pillars. Also the amount of detail that went into the ceiling work. What kind of material was this? And the handrail, and it looks as though all the floors had a lot of detail in them as well. It's a real tragedy that this building was eventually torn down. And we have to wonder why it was. And of course it was torn down during that period of urban renewal, which started in New York City a little bit earlier than the rest of the United States in the mid-1950s. Here we can see the Singer building with other buildings around it. And when we look in at the tower, we see the same type of portal windows and the otherworldly detail that comes with the tower. How can you even assign a style to this? This almost looks like science fiction Renaissance style, or H.G. Wells' imagination Renaissance style. I don't even know what you'd call this. Let me know in the comments. I've never seen anything quite like it, and there's something very striking about the tower. And it was the tower itself that made the Singer building the tallest building in the world for a period of time, before it was surpassed by another building on the list that we're going to be taking a look at. Staying focused on the Singer building, though, there's also detail in the lower portion of the tower. And yet we have other contrasting photos of the interior. Look at those portal lights, or excuse me, those portal windows up in the ceiling, along with the columns and the pillars, the elevators, the balcony, the stairs. This is just a gorgeous building. How could they have ever allowed this to be torn down? The sad story with the end of the Singer building was with the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, created in 1965 in the wake of several notable buildings in the city having either been demolished or threatened with demolition. Although the Singer building was considered to be one of the most iconic buildings in New York City, they never considered designating it as a landmark, which would have prevented its demolition. And from 1967 to 1969, they demolished it. A tragedy. You can see in the photo on the right what the demolishing looks like, and it's strange because of the fact here's the aspect that I want to consider, and I'd like all of you to consider as well. If the mainstream narrative is correct, how easy or how difficult was it for them to construct all these skyscrapers in New York City? The real challenge I see is not getting the material to the port, as this is one of the largest natural harbors in the world, but how exactly do you facilitate the construction and the work of multiple buildings at the same time in this very constrained urban environment? And if you've been to New York City at any point in your life, regardless of when it was, you certainly know that it is a vertical residence. Here's where I love seeing the construction of the tower. And yet, something seems off about this photo as well. We see the same telltale signs that we see in many other photos. So I'm not exactly sure what to make of it. I'm not going to come to any conclusions here, because again, New York City has many conflicting accounts. Here it is once completed, the Woolworth Building, supposedly modeled after Gothic cathedrals in 15th and 16th century Europe. Yet, oddly enough, we don't see any other buildings that look like this. So how exactly can you say that this is a particular style? Well, when it comes to architectural styles, we can say whatever we want to. Again, I prefer Gotham City Revival style. Or perhaps Dark Knight Revival style. Okay, my mind went there. In any event, looking at the gorgeous interior of the building, though, is what really tells the story. And this is why I would love to see photos of the construction of the interior. So if anyone has any access to photos of the construction of the interior of the Woolworth Building, I would be delighted to see them. Look at this detail on the ceiling, the entryway. There is definitely something that went into this. And I find it hard to believe that they were able to put this building up in the time that they did because of this kind of detail on the inside. Even if you did have the artisans to pull this off, how could this have been done in such a short amount of time? And if all this was completed in the time frame that we're given, and this all happened in the mainstream narrative that we're given, we have truly lost tremendous capabilities just in the last 100 years. And that alone should be alarming. And when anyone asks the question about why we're doing this kind of research, if all it does is lead to some explanations that don't make any sense, or even back to even considering the mainstream narrative, and here's the beautiful skylights that I always love seeing, that I've seen in many Capitol buildings and other buildings, along with incredible stairs, archways, and the beautiful internal detail. Calling this building a giant cathedral is no stretch of the imagination. It is something that defies simple explanation, and it's just gorgeous. Going back to what I was saying, though, even if this all leads back to confirming the mainstream narrative, and let's just say that it did, then we have to ask other questions about how we lost this capability and why we allowed this to happen. And you look at this photo. This matches the greatest beauty that I've seen across the world. The interior of this building, and you can see the materials, and you can go to this building and actually touch the interior and determine that it is all hard material, that there is no cheap facading on the inside. They managed to do all of this. And if we accept the mainstream narrative, in a very short amount of time. Something is not adding up, though, about it all, and that's why we have to keep asking these difficult questions. And I believe that the Woolworth Building, which does still stand today and is a place that you can visit and verify, and then again, of course, we see the floor as well, as if everything else isn't enough. There is something completely and totally extraordinary about the very existence of this building, regardless of who really built it or when it was truly built. And I think it's interesting to me that people just want us to maintain a very blasé sense when we see buildings like this. And yet you see there are tourists that'll come and take pictures and they'll accept the narrative and then they'll move on and they won't think twice of it. And now we move on to the New York Stock Exchange building in the financial district of Lower Manhattan in New York City. It's the headquarters of the New York Stock Exchange, composed of two connected structures, occupying part of the city block bounded by Wall Street, Broad Street, New Street, and Exchange Place. The central section of the block contains the original structure at 18 Broad Street, designed in the classical revival style by George B. Post. The northern section contains a 23-story office annex at 11 Wall Street. The marble facade of 18 Broad Street contains colonnades facing east towards Broad Street. Broad Street Colonnade, an icon of the New York Stock Exchange, contains a pediment designed by John Quincy Adams Ward and Paul Wayland Bartlett depicting commerce and industry. We'll take a look at that pediment in a second. The facade 11 Wall Street is simpler in design but contains architectural details similar to those at 18 Broad Street. New York Stock Exchange has occupied the site on Broad Street since 1865 but had to expand its previous building several times. This structure at 18 Broad Street was erected between 1901 and 1903. Again, 2 years. They could really just knock them out then, couldn't they? And there is our pediment depicting commerce and industry. Well, I wonder if that's just an honest depiction of commerce and industry. Very intriguing commerce and industry, as though you have some people that are crawling on their hands and knees trying to make a living. You have some children integrated in there. How exactly does that represent commerce and industry? I don't know, maybe there's somebody out there that can explain it to me in the comments. We see the usual detail on the columns, and again, the New York Stock Exchange looks like it was something that was added in an afterthought. Also look and see all those lions' heads up there above this so-called pediment. Very intriguing. What is with this central figure, and how does this represent commerce and industry? Is this some sort of deity that I haven't heard of? Well, as always, I welcome interpretations in the comments, and perhaps I'm missing something. I don't know if I really see anything representing commerce and industry. I see toil and almost perhaps paying proper tribute to the proper authorities when it comes to deification. I'm not sure. What do you make of it? Even this is a very beautiful entrance, considering the detail that goes into it, and yet once again the New York Stock Exchange feels like it's something that was added in an afterthought. And if you're ever around New York City, this actually conveys the idea that everything feels very compressed within it. And if you've ever been in such a city like this, it constantly gives you that feeling. This is the original photo after completion of construction in 1903. Very interesting how they managed to pull all this off, and yet they really didn't have motorization at that time, and heavy equipment was very limited. Yet it's a very beautiful building, and you can see all the detail that went into it. The interior is nothing less than the exterior. Look at the windows and the walls, along with the detail, of course, put in the ceiling. Because how else would you know that you're actually in a stock exchange building? We've seen the interior of this building in several films throughout time, and I'm always reminded of one of my favorite 80s films, Trading Places, with Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy. Very entertaining film, and quite an interesting message. And here's a photo from 1904 of the facade. I don't know how you could ever call that just a facade. It's utterly incredible what the entryway to the New York Stock Exchange truly looks like. Again, we have all the pillars, and look at that on the building right there. There's even a smaller pediment. You just see pediments everywhere you look. Pediment here, pediment there, here a pediment, there a pediment, everywhere a pediment. Start a song about it. I don't know. There's something with the New York Stock Exchange that seems to indicate that there's much more going on. And here's another interior, modern interior photo of one of the main conference rooms. Look at the beauty in the ceiling and the arches in the walls. You just can't go into one of these buildings and not expect to see this kind of beauty at this point. And I think that's always the other telling aspect is when you look at the interior. And I've endeavored to try to include more interior photos in the explorations because I believe that's where the rest of the story is told. And it's very, very rare that we see photos of the construction of the interiors of the buildings. And if you come across them, if you see them, and I don't care if they're questionable, please send them my way. Apparently this is some sort of rendering or design of the New York Stock Exchange, although this goes back to that old question, is this done by a designer or a recorder? This definitely feels like a recorder. Again, I see the depiction of commerce and industry on the pediment. Quite a fascinating interpretation. And now we save the most incredible for last, the Empire State Building, the 102-story patented Art Deco skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan. Designed by Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon and built from 1930 to 1931. During the Great Depression, they put up the tallest building in the world at 1,250 feet, a record it held until it was surpassed by the World Trade Center in 1970. The Empire State Building, an incredible, gorgeous Art Deco building, and a true, pristine staple of skyscrapers in New York City. And here we have the requisite construction photo of the Empire State Building with the rigid airships and a couple blimps. Very intriguing when we consider this building's reputation of having its spire as a docking port for rigid airships. Something that definitely ties into many old world theories with all the towers and taller buildings and perhaps even lighthouses. And we see its quintessential format in the Empire State Building. Also very fascinating that such a photo would even be taken, showing all these airships and blimps in the immediate vicinity of the building. Was that taken into account with its original design and construction? And if this building was truly built by a different civilization with a different purpose, could this photo have been from that time? Or is this an authentic photo? Or is this a photo that's been altered in some way? They'll tell us that this is the rigid airship, the USS Los Angeles. But how do we know for sure? Or how do we know that the photo is not altered in some way? Some incredible construction photos where we have another very brave worker who was obviously embracing the mentality of work or starve and die. And of course, he was not concerned about falling or doing a Wile E. Coyote from that incredible height, as you can see in this photo. We always question these photos as well, if they're depicting what's really happening. Why is it always a single worker, though? Or just a couple? Why do we not see more wider shots that show more workers? Would have taken a lot of time to tighten all those lug nuts and all those bolts in there. I suppose it could have been done. You see the Chrysler building there, the beautiful building in the distance. How much labor was really taken on this building, and how did they do it in such a short amount of time and during the Great Depression? Did you know that a B-25 bomber crashed into the north side of the Empire State Building in 1945? Apparently, it was an accident that killed 14 people. The bomber pilot found himself in fog. And keep in mind, this is at the tail end of World War II, after the surrender of Germany, but before the capitulation of Japan, supposedly. In any event, I had never heard of this, and I was rather surprised about this. Now, in the official history that we have, and this is what a B-25 bomber looks like, we're told that this bomber crashed into the north side of the building and that this event killed 14 people. However, this was not considered a major event because at no point in time did the structural integrity of the building face any sort of stress from this incident. Isn't this very interesting? And this is a photo that was taken after the B-25 had crashed into the north side of the Empire State Building. And you can sort of see the fire up there towards the top floors behind that column of smoke or steam, or whatever's in the foreground. Interesting photo and very blurry. I guess it does indicate that it could be foggy or it's just the smoke. Hard to say, but it's very intriguing to me that this did happen, and here's a photo from the cleanup. And yet this was a minor inconvenience for the Empire State Building. It did not threaten its structural integrity, and the very next day after this accident, the floor was opened and they were operating as if nothing had happened. They really knew how to build them back then, didn't they? And they could build them in a very short amount of time. And I've been to the Empire State Building. It was back in 2006, and I remember just being awed at its size and yet the detail that you see in the base. And of course, they'll call it the Art Deco style. But it's still just amazing the amount of time that this stellar skyscraper was constructed. And here's some of the interior, the elevators that you can go into. There's just something, again, otherworldly about this building. Yet it seems like it's something that we built. We're told that our civilization built it. Yet there are so many other different connotations and meanings to it. And you look at this grand entry hall and you see all the detail and the material that went into it. And when you go in this building, you'll again find that no expense was spared. It's beautiful. All the material is genuine. And it was built during the Great Depression. People always want to say, well, they had more money back then. I just don't know. Consider joining the channel as a member. You can be an explorer and receive early access to content, or you can be a Prime Explorer and have exclusive content that you can't watch on the regular channel. As always, ask questions, explore yourself, and you'll restore the world. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for joining me today.